Hi, everyone. Tonight we're going to take a look at the question of did Marcion, we'll tell you who he is in a minute, corrupt Paul to be anti law and faith alone? And it'll sound like I'm giving him a pass. It's possible that we need to investigate this issue because it's possible that a follower of Paul made him look even more anti-law, more apostate than he really was, and more faith alone than he really was. We need to explore that possibility because it's pretty obvious that something happened to Paul's writings in a range of time that fit this possibility. And even if it's incorrect or can't be proven, it's worthwhile investigating because it teaches us what is the manuscript evidence for Paul's writings. You'll be shocked to know how late they come, and you would be interested to see what kind of interpretations that Marcion even has of Paul, whether he is being faithful to Paul or he is extending him and expanding him beyond what he should be. And then also, we're going to learn a little bit more about the reaction to Marcion, which is really a reaction to Paul's teachings. And then you and I can then reassess, well, how was the early church handling this at the time? Where was the heresy? The heresy you will see in the early church was those who were teaching the doctrines of Paul. And so this is a part of history. You can tell me if you've ever heard of it before, but I'm almost guaranteed 99% of you don't even know what I am talking about. And so then you have to ask yourself, why is this part of Christian history suppressed? And when we get to the Constantinian era, this kind of information is pushed back into the background, and Paul is brought to the foreground because Constantine needs to get rid of Sabbath in particular, and he hates the Mosaic Law, and he hates the Jews, he hates the Mosaic Law, and all of those things. Could that have a reason why you've never heard of what I'm going to tell you about Marcion? Because most of you don't have a clue. I know with all my studies of Christianity, and I did a lot of in-depth study. When I first heard of Marcion, it was like a shock to me. Like I couldn't believe it. There was a movement to take Paul and make him the only apostle and throw out the 12. That sounds like something that's happening today, with dispensationalism. This is happening in 144 AD. And this movement was so powerful, people thought it was going to take over. So with that in mind, I'm going to actually start now, give you the title of where I want to go. I want to say, hey, did this guy take, in his zeal to advance Paul, did he take it and corrupt him even further in that direction? And then we'll see whether that's true or not. Anyway, we will now take a break and go backwards and look at the issue about who is Marcion. So those of you who are not familiar, and I've not covered him in depth yet, we'll do a little bit of that here. So this is going to be sort of part one. This will be introduction to Marcionism is what this will be. So we're going to ask the question, who is Marcion? He's a shipbuilder of Pontus, but he's more than that, as we'll see. Okay, so we'll take a look at this page. This is on our website. It's called Marcionism, the Forgotten Crisis. Overview. An important but frequently forgotten episode in the early church was the movement founded by Marcion near 144 AD. It is known as Marcionism. It is important because it explains the two Gospels in the current New Testament, why they were tolerated, meaning why were Paul's writings tolerated in the first place. Marcionism was a split in the church that almost divided Christianity in two. And we're talking about Christianity of the 200s and 300s, so that Christianity prior to Constantine. Okay, Marcion taught only Paul had the correct gospel of Jesus, i.e. faith alone, but the 12 apostles presented a Jesus who supposedly had a superseded gospel that did not apply to Gentiles. Sounds very modern, doesn't it, if you know dispensationalism? But this is actually their teaching of this time period, 144 AD. Marcion said the 12 taught a gospel of law where disobedience caused loss of salvation, especially found in Matthew's gospel. A prominent leader of early Orthodox Christianity was Tertullian. In 207 AD, Tertullian wrote a book called Against Marcion. It's the most published book of that era, and to rebut Marcion by attacking Paul. He questioned whether Paul was an apostle of Jesus Christ, saying a self-serving claim, as Paul made of being an apostle of Jesus Christ, does not suffice. Tertullian suggested Paul was a false prophet. He also called Paul the apostle of the heretics. But just so you know, we did a thorough review of this book Against Marcion in prior episodes. And what happens at the very end is Tertullian says, okay, even though I've proved satisfactorily he's not an apostle of Jesus Christ and so on, I still have to hold on to Paul having some validity, because God tells me in Genesis 49:27 that Paul is the Benjamite wolf in the morning, but in the evening he divides the food. And because of that, I'm not going to completely reject him. So that's how he holds on to him in the end. The problem for poor Tertullian, he's looking at the Greek Septuagint mistranslation, and the actual words were, in the evening, the Benjamite wolf will what? Will divide the spoils, meaning the ill-gotten gains. And Paul, if you read the whole passage of the Benjamite wolf, it's a prophecy of someone at the same time as the Messiah, basically. In it's Genesis 49, I think it's verse 10 through 12, is the prophecy of the tribe of Judah would have one who would come, and he would have the blood of grapes all over his clothing. I mean, that's a prophecy of Jesus and his robe and all of that. And that at the same time period will come this Benjamite wolf, who in the morning will kill, which Paul did in the beginning of his ministry, or his work on behalf of according to him, the high priest. And then in the evening, he divided Christianity in two and split off the Gentiles. And that was the spoil he was taking. So it was not a good thing. He was illicitly taking that. That's what the word spoil means in Hebrew. So anyway, Tertullian didn't know that, because he couldn't know what he couldn't know. He's looking at a Greek Septuagint, and the whole of history, in my opinion, would have been totally different, Christian history, if that word had been translated correctly as spoils, because he would then have completely rejected Paul, and he was the major voice of Christianity in that time. 207 AD, he is the voice of Christianity. There are no popes that are more influential than him. There's no other writers more influential to him. There's no Augustines yet. He was the game. So whatever he said, people were taking seriously. And the man has an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible. And he was a lawyer, by the way. So he was pretty effective in his presentations. Anyway, continuing. Now, this is in our book, Jesus' Words on Salvation, at page 578. So this is my second book. So I paid a lot more attention to Marcion in the second book. Then I say this: has the last 400 years been a waste? Has the descent, meaning since the Reformation, has the descent into cheap grace at odds with Jesus' doctrine all this time been an unprecedented error? No. This has been a valuable period of cleansing of doctrinal errors. However, our response to those errors ended up in overreaction. We needed to come back to Jesus. It was that simple. We can take encouragement from the fact that this very same error happened once before. And I'm talking about the Marcion controversy. Let's see how the early church escaped, and perhaps we can simply repeat the measures taken back then. So how did the church, presented with that dispensationalism of Marcion, how did it escape and become victorious before their next assault, which became in 325 from Constantine? Well, most Protestants are utterly unaware that Paulinism, in particular faith alone doctrine, previously threatened to overwhelm Jesus' salvation doctrine and destroy it. And by the way, this is Tertullian's point in his book, that if you accepted Marcion's doctrines of faith alone, and you would be destroying the doctrines of Jesus. And he quotes Jesus, the same passages I was quoting in my book, in Jesus' Words Only, right, in that book. Same passages. He saw all the conflicts himself. And he concluded Paul was a false apostle. He was not, there was no verifiable claim that he was an apostle of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. That much he was unequivocal about. But he said, I'm not going to reject him completely because of the Genesis 49, verse 27 issue that I told you about. Anyway, in 144, there arose a shipbuilder from Pontus named Marcion. He founded a church system that rivaled in numbers and influence that of the Orthodox Christian Church. Let me highlight this so you can follow me. By 150 AD, Justin wrote that the Marcionites had expanded to the uttermost bounds of the earth. This is in Justin's Apology 1.26. By the way, you can just type that in, Justin 1.26, and it'll come up on Google. You can read it. It required 300 years of the Orthodox Church, meaning the normative church, not the like Eastern Orthodox type church, the center of orthodoxy of the church, to eventually rout out the heresy of Marcion. Marcion was not battling the Roman Catholic Church. It did not yet exist. Instead, there was a large Orthodox church, meaning normative church, led from Jerusalem. The Roman bishop was just one bishop among many throughout the Mediterranean. Even if Peter was in Rome at one point, there was no effort to exercise superiority from Rome until many centuries later. What happened is that Marcion declared in 144 that Paul alone was the true apostle for the era of grace. The 12 apostles in particular, their Gospel of Matthew, were tainted by legalism, that Jesus of the 12 belonged to the God of the Old Testament, and the Jesus of Paul represented the Son of a loving Father who now accepted us by faith alone. In Marcion's book known as the Antitheses, which exists only in fragments quoted by others, we find endorsement of everything Pauline, including faith alone. Marcion's primary antithesis involved faith and law. On one hand, there was the law given Moses, which the Apostolic 12 endorsed in Matthew's Gospel. On the other hand, there was the faith alone doctrine of Paul. To solve this antithesis, Marcion invented the idea that Christ had two personages, the one of the 12 and the one presented by Paul. So, in other words, he instead of saying that Jesus had two dispensation for the Jews, and then that had to be abandoned and it would go to the Gentiles. There's two Jesuses now, just so you get the way he can rationalize this is to do that. The Jesus of the 12 represented the creator God of the Old Testament. The Jesus of Paul represented the good God of the Father, represented the good God or the Father of the New Testament. And here we're going to read to you. This is from William Meeks's book. Remember, I've shown you where the quote of Ambrose the Astor talks about Paul being a false apostle and so on. This is at 2007, pages 286, 87, and we give you a URL to it. And he's excerpting the English translation from the 1925 German work of New Testament scholar Harnack, very person who spent a lot of time on Marcion. So this is the quote, the most authentic quote you will find of the Antitheses. The Jewish Christ, and I'm putting in brackets so you understand what can keep in your mind these two rival ideas. You know what? I'm going to break right here, and then we'll do the quotes, and we'll come right back. All right, so we'll pick up where we're reading. Paragraph 18. The Jewish Christ, this is the original paragraph numbering that came up with this. So this is a very long document, very obviously well thought out by Marcion. So, but these are the key paragraphs. The Jewish Christ, bracket of Matthew, that's what I'm saying, at all, was designated by the Creator, and he means by that the God of the Old Testament. So the Creator is, I should make this clear, he believes anyone who created matter is inferior to the God who is of spirit. So this Creator God, Yahweh, is inferior to another God known as the Father. Okay, so i.e. the God of the Old Testament, solely to restore the Jewish people from the diaspora. So the Jewish Christ was designated by the Creator, the inferior God of the Old Testament, solely to restore the Jewish people from the diaspora. Okay, but our Christ, present in Paul's writings, was commissioned by the good God, bracket, of the New Testament to liberate all mankind. The good, in that bracket, God of Paul's Jesus, that's another bracket, is good toward all men. The Creator, God of the Jesus of the 12, in brackets, however, promises salvation only to those who are obedient to him, that is, who are legalistic, and that's the term he would use. The good God of Paul's Jesus redeems those who believe in him, but he does not judge those who are disobedient to him. In other words, if you disobey this God, the good God of Paul, no disobedience will ever be judged by the good God. He's given up judgment on anybody for doing wrong anymore. And he means literally. The Creator, the God of the 12, Jesus, however, redeems his faithful and judges and punishes the sinners. So you can see there's one God that's really, really good because has no judgment, and he seriously means that when the other God who does punishment is bad and punishment is evil. So the other God, the Creator God, the Yahweh God, he's bad. But the good God is the God of the Jesus Christ, the other Jesus Christ, who is with the good Father. So everything on the Paul side of the ledger is the good Christ, the good God, just to make it clear, the good God, the good Christ. On the other side is the Christ who serves the God who is judgmental and punishes and is not as good or good as the God who is the good God of the other Jesus. Okay, it sounds convoluted, but this was overwhelming Christianity. People were turning to Paulinism in this package because this was the only way, honestly, to reconcile all Paul's passages. Because how else can you really do it? It's God can't contradict himself, right? So Paul is contradicting the God of the Bible, the Old Testament, So you have to come up with a solution, and this was his solution. There's no contradiction because Paul's not contradicting the true higher God. He's not contradicting the true higher Christ. The Christ who ascended is this higher Christ, and he's different than the Christ who died on the cross, who has to go serve the other God, the creator God, in somewhere else, and we'll see where that is. Let me continue. The Christ of the Creator God, represented by the 12, promises to the Jews the restoration of their former condition by return of their land after death, a refuge in Abraham's bosom in the underworld, Sheol. So, in other words, that means Jesus, God Yahweh, take those Jews who thought obedience was necessary because their God was one who would punish them for disobedience. They're all going to go to Sheol. They're all going to basically what is otherwise known as hell. But it's supposed to be a tolerable place because they were. This God, Creator God, is not all bad, I guess, but that's where those people go, and everyone else who follows Paul will go to heaven with no judgment possible. You can commit all, you can be anything you want. And I'm saying there were little licentious people. I'm saying they said there's no consequence to sinning anymore, and you're all going to heaven, and you all be living, this wonderful experience in heaven with Jesus, the ascended Jesus, and the good God the Father. Okay, so this is, you have to narrate it as you go along because it's kind of so crazy. Okay. So you'll go into the bosom of the underworld. Our Christ, here's the final words, our Christ of the Jesus presented by Paul will establish the kingdom of God in eternal and heavenly possession. So in other words, when he says our Christ, he means the Christ of the Marcions. He's going to establish the kingdom of God in its eternal and heavenly possession. So that's going to be in heaven. So he is not regarding anything to do with the book of Revelation. So, what do we have? First of all, one thing we need to notice is his adversary is the book of Matthew. He doesn't care about Mark, and he doesn't know of Luke. Now, if you understand that Luke, and he doesn't know anything about Acts. So, where are those books? Now, again, we have another series that shows that the book of Luke and the book of Acts was written as trial briefs to win an appeal, and they were submitted to Most Excellent Theophilus to win that appeal. So those two works were not intended for Christians when they were made. They were made for a hearing, an appeal, if you will, of Paul to Nero that was going to be held 2 years after the book of Acts closes. So those books the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke were intended for a different purpose than to be given to Christians. They were intended to be given to pagans, particularly the book of Acts. So that's why they were probably put in a bookshelf and a file and whatever. And most scholars say they did not appear in history anywhere until 140 AD. So it's not surprising. Well, the book of Acts doesn't appear until 140 AD. It's not surprising. Now, it's not surprising that he doesn't know anything about the book of Acts. But what happened is Luke was given a different course. He was released at about this time, 140 AD, and apparently Marcion does know about it because people say he is using Luke's gospel. You can see the quotations he makes is of Luke's gospel, not of Matthew. So, but he never says what gospel he's looking at. It's just an inference everybody reaches that it's Luke's gospel he's looking at. And he changes Luke's gospel and he alters it in his translations, and we'll get into that. Okay, so I think you get a picture. This guy is a wackadoodle. I mean, he's got a crazy theory, but it's the only way you can reconcile Paul to Paul, or otherwise you have Paul has to be an apostate. He's contradicting God. But this way, the God that Paul serves is not being contradicted. He is a God who has no law and has no judgments and doesn't judge people for sin. He's basically, if you just believe in me, faith alone, you will go to heaven. All right, let's continue. The Jerusalem church previously replied to anti-law and faith alone doctrine by saying Paul was an apostate and that did not represent true Christianity. Well, people say to me, oh, that's not true. Well, the best scholar says so. One of the best scholars, James Dunn, professor, the most direct heirs of the Jewish Christian groupings within earliest Christianity, that is the Jerusalem church, regarded Paul as the great apostate and arch enemy. And he cites Epistula Petri, the Clementine homilies, And this is James D.G. Dunn, the Cambridge Companion to St. Paul, Cambridge 2003, at page 2. So he understands the earliest church was opposed to Paul. Now he might say, oh, well, I don't mean the apostles, but it's too late. We now know from the same book here, William Meeks, we have that quote of Ambrose Astor saying the 12 who decided Paul was a false apostle. And he just says it matter-of-factly in his commentary on the epistle to the Corinthians. Now, the Jerusalem church response is directly reflected in our New Testament. As Augustine noted in 413 AD in his treatise Faith and Works, the epistles of James, the first bishop of Jerusalem, Jude, the second bishop of Jerusalem, another brother of Jesus, and 2 Peter were specifically written to destroy the faithful and doctrine, as inferred from Paul's epistles. And I just want to say this to all the people who cite me 2 Peter all the time, say, oh, he's confirmed. Paul's confirmed by that. First of all, you don't know what epistles 2 Peter actually saw. But if you read 2 Peter in context, he is condemning those who teach a lawless doctrine based on these, really what he says in Greek is disnoetos, nonsensical. Some things Paul says are nonsensical, and people construe them to their own destruction and fall into the lawless life of error and fall from their steadfastness in Christ. So you have to read the whole thing. If you just read one little part, you're missing it. The point of 2 Peter is that he's criticizing Paul's writing. He's criticizing that Paul's words are being construed by clearly unstable and ignorant people. Now, you're going to imagine you're not ignorant and unstable, but you don't realize Peter is saying the ignorant and unstable construe it to lawless ends. That's the word in the next sentence. So that's the people who are ignorant and unstable who construe a lawlessness from Paul. But the truth is, we don't know what he's really looking at, and we can see that, in fact, Paul has a very lawless doctrine, unless, which is the topic of this whole series, was Marcion willing to corrupt Paul to bring him to even a more apostate position than he really was? And so we're going to examine that here and see, can we cut him a break spiritually, meaning that means we can't rely upon any of that doctrine anymore for Paul either. Because if I prove to you that Marcion could be the complete cause of Paul looking as corrupt as he does in terms of being faith alone, contradicting Jesus, abrogating the law, which is being an apostate, we could conclude that it was Marcion who changed Paul's writings and made them into that appearance. That's a possibility that we're going to explore. And even if we can't prove it, it's going to be a good exercise. We're going to learn how these manuscripts, when they came into existence, is it plausible? If it's not plausible, why? When did Paul's writings even surface? And we're going to see they surfaced in 200 AD, not earlier, after this movement of Marcion. So there's no way of knowing seriously whether Paul's writings, as we have them, were not tampered, because Marcion's movement existed 60 years before the oldest manuscripts we have of Paul, and that's the P46 manuscript from 200 AD. But we'll get into that more. So who are the opponents according to Augustine? Augustine was proving that faith alone is incorrect, and he is right when you compare it to Jesus. And he cites who? James. That's clear. Even Luther admitted that was contradictory of faith alone. Jude, very much so if you read it. Someone teaches a grace that's a license to immorality, and that's Paul is even saying that somebody's accusing me of this. So Jude's purpose is to attack Paul. 2 Peter, for the reasons I just explained. 2 Peter even said many would fall from their steadfastness in Christ by relying upon the difficult to understand passages in the writings of Paul. These passages were seen as giving a liberty, in quotes, that 2 Peter said was foreign to the true gospel. Tertullian, an Orthodox member in Carthage, Africa, wrote in 207 AD his famous rebuttal to Marcion. In it, Tertullian raised every ground possible. So now I just want to put this in context. Paul's writings, the oldest we have, are just about the same time as this book is written, 200 AD approximately. So literally, Tertullian, whatever he's saying, we can reconstruct what Paul likely appeared sometime maybe a little bit before 207. So this would be a place to keep your eyes and ears out. Are any of the quotes of Paul in Tertullian ever different from the Paul we know today? Now, I've read against Marcion at least 5 times, and I've read a lot of it in Latin, and I don't see that. But you know what? I want to show we're going to be objective and keep our ear open for anything that can justify an excusing Paul for teaching faith alone, for appearing to teach faith alone, and teaching what appears to be apostasy against the law. We're going to look and see, can we find excuses that didn't really happen? But that would also mean that we'd be basically throwing out all of his epistles on a ground of textual corruption by Marcion. So that's all that. But that's another way of approaching the Paul problem, and that's what I'm showing you. That's a possibility that we can present, and it's a good exercise to go through, even if you can't at this time prove it. But I'm going to show you what are the issues. Tertullian. Okay, listen to this. Tertullian, an Orthodox Church member in Carthage, Africa, wrote in 207 AD his famous rebuttal to Marcion. In it, Tertullian raised every ground possible to dispute whether Paul was truly an apostle of Jesus Christ. Tertullian even suggested Paul was a false prophet as warned of by Jesus Christ. He actually refers to the Matthew 24 passage that we've been talking about, saying Jesus said, many will come in my name and whatever. And he says, so it's possible that Paul is a false prophet. He throws it out as a possibility himself. We previously quoted this daring analysis at page 395 to 400 of our first book, Jesus Words Only, and it's at googlebooks.com, and you can just view the full link and you can read the quotes. In that passage, Tertullian said that Paul's claim to apostleship is totally self-serving and by Jesus' standard is invalid. And that's true. If you look at all the quotes of where Paul is called an apostle of Jesus Christ, it's always in Paul's own mouth. Nobody else says it. Nobody. The quotes of Jesus in Acts 9, 22 and 26 by Paul testifying about what happened in the road to Damascus. Paul doesn't even say there that Jesus appointed him an apostle of Jesus Christ. And all of the letters of James or Peter or Luke or anything, there's no reference to Paul being an apostle of Jesus Christ. And the word apostle can mean messenger. So if he's called a messenger, it doesn't mean he's an apostle of Jesus Christ. It has to say Jesus Christ made him an apostle, made him a messenger of him. Okay, so let's continue. In that passage, Tertullian says that Paul's claim to apostleship is totally self-serving and by Jesus' standards is invalid. Scholars generally now recognize that this is a valid criticism of Paul's claims. In the end, Tertullian even suggested Paul is the apostle of the heretics. Okay, that's what it literally says in Latin. Okay, so Tertullian is writing in Latin, and the word is hereticorum apostolis. So I had a whole thing where some guy tried to say, I got this wrong. There's nothing wrong. That's exactly what those words mean. He's the apostle of the heretics, and other scholars agree. So I'm not going to fight that battle again. You could try to dispute that, but I know the Latin very well, and the scholar, he even, some guy tried to get to help him, said agreed that my literal translation was literally correct, but he said you could interpret it, generally or more broadly, that it means the apostle whom the heretics adopted as their apostle. Well, no, he is the apostle of the heretics. It was an intentional slight on Paul. Anyway, let's continue. Often Protestant historians try to obscure the real nature of Marcion's heresy. They focus on every other dispute than the problem of Marcion's teaching of faith alone. This is why you never hear about Marcionism, because when they have to tell you about it, they then don't want to tell you it's a faith alone movement. And they don't want to tell you it's a Paul movement. They'll tell you it's a Gnostic God or some other obscure facts. They try to downplay the reality, its core meaning, its core function, its core belief system. But it's all here. While it is true that Marcion said there was a different God for the New versus the Old Testaments, and this was battled vigorously by Tertullian, they ignore what was at stake. Marcion's goal behind that argument was to justify two different salvation doctrines. Once he divided salvation into two dispensations, the Old and the New, and I mean, he did a complete separation. Like, now you have two gods, two Jesuses, now you can solve your contradictions. There are no more contradictions because there's two gods, two Jesus, and the Jesus who goes to heaven with the new good Father, that God, that Jesus is giving all these messages of faith alone, and he can't be contradicting the God that he's with, that God the Father. But this other God, this negative God, the Yahweh God supposedly, is with the Jesus who was on earth, and those two are now in Sheol and hell basically, and they're going to get have to live there. And that separated and created two dispensations that can then rationally justify the contradictions Paul would otherwise have had with the Jesus of this earth, because there's two Jesuses now. You see how he got around it? Very clever, man. It's ingenious. And frankly, that's we've seen other acrobatics like that in modern dispensationalism. But let's keep going here. I want to wrap it up here and show you. This is just an introduction. Once he divided salvation into two dispensations, the old and new, Marcion could defend the new is by faith alone and the old one is by obedience. Marcion hence was trying to rationalize Paul's doctrine of faith alone as belonging to a distinct dispensation of Paul's Jesus. Thereby, it could be valid despite contradicting Jesus' salvation doctrine in the Gospel of Matthew and John, properly translated. As Arthur Cushman and Gert in A History of Christian Thought, Scribners and Sons, 1949, at page 59, explains. For the gospel of the free grace of God and salvation by faith alone had been substituted, and I put in brackets, by the 12 apostles in their gospels, so Marcion believed, by a legalism of a genuinely Jewish character. So you can see that Marcion is against the alleged legalism of what Jesus taught, and instead Marcion is claiming it should have always been faith alone, and that was being substituted by the 12 with this other doctrine of the original Jesus who was on earth. And that's why Marcion is saying we need to point instead to the Jesus who ascended, and he's not on earth. In the other Jesus, the Jesus we all know from the Gospels, he's in Sheol, he's in hell. I mean, he doesn't use that word, but Sheol is hell, or the land of the dead, if you want to say something else. Next, hence, to destroy the significance of the different salvation doctrine in the 12 apostles' gospels, Marcion claimed Paul had the right to proclaim a superseding one. Thus, Marcion represented a vigorous effort to erase any role of repentance and obedience in the Christian doctrine of salvation. Quote, this is from Alec Burkill, The Evolution of Christian Thought, Cornell University Press, 1971 at 42. And these are books actually found, so I know they exist. Marcion expounded his main position in a work entitled Antitheses. The God of the New Testament was the God of grace who offered salvation to all by faith alone. So do you see, there is no dispute about that. Some people try to say, oh, he wasn't the same as Paul. He's identical to Paul because he's relying on Paul. Well, he's relying upon the Paul maybe that he corrupted. So that's what we're going to ask a question later. After Simon Magus, it was Marcion, above whom, this is in Hans Kung, The Church, Image Books, 1976 to 316. After Simon Magus, it was Marcion, above all, whom the fathers regarded as the arch heretic. The law is discarded and salvation depends on faith alone. So I think I've made the point. You can't get around it. Tertullian, in rebuttal to Marcion, conceded that the ceremonial law of the Old Covenant was no longer applicable as the temple was destroyed a century earlier, but the moral commandments in the law remained. To this end, Tertullian taught repentance and obedience remained absolutely essential to salvation. And that was in my prior work, Jesus was Words Only, 2007, at page 405 to 425. And we did very lengthy exposition of many passages of his. Now, I'm just expressing my own personal reaction when I found these things. And maybe you're going to relate, most of you, I think we're going to relate to what my own reaction to learning of these shocking facts was. Here's what I say. When I encountered this history, I was shocked and in disbelief. I mean, aren't you, if you haven't heard of this before? David Burkott, a Protestant attorney like myself, was as equally startled by encountering Marcion as I was. I now know he's an Anabaptist. I think he's a deacon or an elder or something in their church. Very good man, as far as I can tell. After Burkott did a comprehensive survey of the doctrines of the early church in his exhaustive 705-page Dictionary of Early Christian Beliefs, by the way, a tome that if you could afford the money and the space on your shelf, is amazing, amazing book. He wrote, "Will the real heretics please stand up?" Who are the real heretics? Well, in that work, Burkott admits he discovered that the early church, in, quote, he says, contradiction to many of my own theological views, end of quote, taught doctrines that universally rejected teachings which we all recognize as part of modern accepted Pauline teaching. When Burkott discusses Marcion, he expresses the same shock I experienced when I first read Marcion taught. And here's the quote from Mr. Burkott, and this is page 66 of Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up? It's a small book. It's not thin. It won't take a lot on the shelf. I recommend you buy it. It's fun to reading. He's a good writer. As surprising as all of this may be to you, what I'm about to tell you is even more bizarre. There was a religious group labeled as heretics by the early Christians who strongly disputed the church's stance on salvation and works. In my brackets, I put in there, i.e., that salvation depended on works. Continuing. Instead, he's talking about the heretics, taught man is totally depraved, that we're saved solely by grace, that works play no role in salvation, and that we cannot lose our salvation once we obtain it. Okay, he's talking about Marcion. All those things are true of Marcionism. It is obvious that Marcionism has revived. Many Protestants likewise today argue a dispensational division exists between old and new, so that Jesus' contrary salvation doctrine to Paul's doctrines can be honestly dismissed as irrelevant. And I have whole stuff on that. Jesus and the early church had a solution to prevent Paul's teachings from overturning those of Jesus. They were, one, how did the early church deal with this? One, they released the epistles of James, Jude, and 2 Peter, just as Augustine says, to defeat faith alone. That's how they were dealing with it. The release of the revelation of Jesus Christ with its heavy emphasis on works required for salvation, including a reaffirmation of James's principles in Revelation 3:1-3. And everybody agrees when you study those verses, it's the same thing as James teaches. And then finally, Tertullian's brilliant examination in 207 AD of the lack of authenticity to Paul's claims of apostleship, and even Tertullian's suggestion that Paul was a false prophet predicted by Christ in Matthew 24, just as we said recently. These various attacks on Paulinism were vigorous and well-sustained. Marcion was defeated. These critical analyses must be republished for a new generation. That's what we're trying to do and try to promote that with everyone. For 400 years, we have been entrapped, meaning post-Reformation, within revived Marcionism. So what happened is, instead of us getting what should have been balance, instead of going Karlstadt's way, he was the co-founder of the Reformation with Luther, and he said, hey, we need to basically realize Jesus is more important than Paul. That was Karlstadt's proposed canon, to take Jesus and put him in a separate section, the higher tier, the number one tier, and put Paul and all the epistles in a lower tier. So we would not lose sight of who is the one we need to be listening to. And Luther went crazy and had him ejected from the town of Wittenberg over that book. But anyway, I digress. And we have a whole video series on that. Because Christ's words were so powerful, Christianity lived on despite this albatross of Paul weighing down on them. His words, weighing down his, meaning Jesus' words, in the wrong direction. Yet by our dereliction of duty, Christ's message is obscured. How did this happen? All right, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. That's the issue of the Reformation, and we're going to just leave it there. And I'm going to say that's an introduction to Marcionism, and you can see it's a person who had the same goals and ideals of Paul. The only thing is he couldn't square what Paul was saying with having one God and one Jesus. You had to have a Jesus who ascended is extremely different than the Jesus who was here on earth. And you have to have a different God, because if Jesus just changes in heaven, but the God of heaven is still this judgmental Yahweh, well, that won't work. So you have to have a good God in the heaven who matches Paul. And then you have to have this very, negative view of the God Yahweh and put him in Sheol, put him in hell with Jesus of the earth. And he didn't say Sheol was hell. I'm just telling you that's what it means in the Bible, basically. So that's how he solved it. And he resolved the contradiction. And to him, there is no contradiction. He got rid of it, because the Jesus of heaven and the Jesus of the good Father are both on the same page. There's no judgment, no law. It's faith alone, and that's it. And we can all live and be happy and just smile all the time. And that's really how easy Marcion did it. And it was overpowering the church until the work of Against Marcion. So the church pivotally was defended by this work against Marcion. So we need to basically thank Marcion. If we hadn't had that, we would have lost completely out to the Pauline gospel way earlier than we did. But now we've been wiped out for the last 400 years in Protestantism. We have become an offshoot that is almost indistinguishable from Marcionism today, except we don't believe in two Jesuses and two gods. Okay, so that's the only difference. We're less paganized than Marcion was. Okay, so again, that's the end of this introduction. We're going to get into, did Marcion corrupt Paul to make him look more faith alone and more anti-law than he really was? And maybe he wasn't. So we'll leave all possibilities on the table. It'll be a good exercise to do it. All right. So I hope everyone will find that interesting. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.